Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you find yourself in the world, we are delighted to have the opportunity to be with you in the ICF Converge community. For those of you watching the initial webinar broadcast on October 28th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, we'd love for you to share in the chat. Where are you? In one word, where are you geographically? And in one word, where are you emotionally? And as you're typing, I am Chris Carpenter, and I am joined by Michelle Light. Michelle and I began the creation of the Leadership in Grief framework at the beginning of the pandemic, and we have presented it many times since. It has continued to evolve as the world has evolved and as our audiences have evolved. One thing that has not evolved, though, the topic of loss and grief. That is universal. And it has become an increasingly important topic for leaders to consider as we are emerging into the next stage of work and life. If you found your way here, you yourself may be experiencing a loss or have heard several of your clients talking about it. This framework is a new lens and sense-making tool to consider as you embark upon these difficult conversations about difficult emotions with your leaders. As one logistical note, if you are watching this content on October 28th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, feel free to use the chat function to ask any questions. Michelle and I will be monitoring the chat to the best of our ability. If we don't get to all your questions, we will aim to address any unanswered questions in the Pathable platform hosted by ICF Converge. And if you're watching at your convenience at a later time, you can contact us through Pathable. Our contact information will also be shared at the end of this session. Let me pass it to Michelle.
Thank you, Chris. As we settle in together, Chris and I would like to offer a poem. It's called An Invitation to Brave Space by Mickey Scott Bay Jones. For those of you who are more visual, feel free to read along. And for others, you can just listen to my voice and let the words sink in. Together, we will create brave space, because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars. We've all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. The space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together. And we will work on it side by side. Chris and I thought this poem was a perfect way to ground us. Together, we will create brave space. This is what we aim to do with you here. This is what you aim to do with your clients with every coaching conversation. The world has been swept up in a swirl of emotions. One in particular, grief. There are all sorts of causes for this. Leaders are grappling with historic challenges all at once. Plagued by a global pandemic, roiled by economic devastation, seared by centuries of systemic racism, compounded by political unrest and catastrophic climate emergencies around the planet. Life as we knew it, it's not the same, and it may never be again. We acknowledge that we may be experiencing things deeply and uniquely. This will not remain static. This webinar is meant to meet us wherever we are and however we are today. In this brave space, we offer all of you a new potential lens in order to summon a path forward. Chris and I are being bold as we're making a connection between loss, grief, and leadership. Now, for Chris and I, our professional paths have been quite different. I've primarily led in the nonprofit and public sectors, Chris in the private sector. We met when we both became certified as leadership coaches at Georgetown University, and that instantly bonded us together.
Michelle and I have continued to deepen our bond as we engage, share, and make meaning of the current world. I've had my own personal grief journey. When I was in my 30s, the plan was to have children. For me, this involved torturous years of fertility treatments and disappointment that culminated in a pregnancy of twins, only to end in a devastating miscarriage. I found myself in deep emotions with no understanding or support. I experienced the isolation and loneliness and separation from those around me. That led me to explore the contours of grief. I have had decades of facilitating grief groups and providing one-on-one grief support. It has been an interest and a passion separate from my professional work. All of these parts of me collided in our ongoing pandemic because of my friend, fellow Georgetown coach, and unexpected blessing, Michelle. Through conversation, as COVID was initially taking its toll, Michelle and I were both observing what was happening around us and inside of us. We were noticing our deep emotions and curious about how it was impacting us and others. We started to connect dots. We have continued to collect and connect more dots. Drawing upon our combined expertise, that led to the birth of our leadership and grief framework. Loss entered my world again and again during the pandemic in unexpected and unwanted ways. My beloved nephew lost his battle to mental illness in October of 2020, and my father died from acute leukemia in June of 2021. Each of these personal experiences of mine has led Michelle and I to reconsider and reshape our content. The same has been true for Michelle and her own personal experiences with loss. It is with deep purpose and authenticity that we are here with you to provide you a new lens for you to lead in a world of loss. We each continue to use this framework ourselves while we travel our own losses.
As you look at the map of today's session, you'll see what we have in store for the next 45 minutes we have together. Please also take a moment to ensure that your environment is comfortable for you. With the flow of the agenda, we're intentional about how we invite you to delve into this topic and how we aim to restore you. We strive to be purposeful in order to ground all of the emotions that may come up. We also respect that this may be difficult and not for everyone. Perhaps, if it's useful, take one deep inhale through your nose like you're smelling a fragrant flower. And then a long, slow exhale like you're gently blowing bubbles through a straw. We invite you to look around and maybe make one extra adjustment, if necessary, so that you can show up the way that you'd like to show up. What's one distraction that you can eliminate for yourself? Now, let's shift into loss. Every grief group begins with this question: what is your loss? Each person goes around the room and shares how it's hit them in their core. Today, we ask each of you that very same question and invite you to enter in the chat or write down for yourself. What is your loss? You could consider the last few weeks, the last few months, whatever time frame feels right. We're going to allow you a minute to respond. And while you're typing, consider this. For many people, loss may be defined as loss of an actual life. That is real now. People have died, like Chris's nephew and dad. And we ask you to stay open-minded about what else you may experience as loss. Loss of your livelihood, job prospects, economic security, loss of your own physical and mental health. loss of outlets that bring you joy, loss of routine, control, purpose, loss of a sense of justice, loss of dreams of the future. There's been a lot of loss. Some losses are concrete, others are more intangible. Society often tells us what we can mourn and what we can't. Like this, that's a legitimate loss. That, not so much. Sometimes we're not comfortable naming a loss or even convinced it is a loss, or we feel like there's this hierarchy of loss. It can create a sense of disenfranchised grief, which is a term that was first coined in the 1980s by Dr. Kenneth Doka. We're here to tell you that you cannot compare my loss to your loss, my grief to your grief. Each person is different and every grieving situation is unique. There is no singular way that everyone reacts to loss. Let me offer one example from my own world. When the pandemic took hold last year, under my circumstances, I'm single and I live alone. The loneliness factor, it was acute on occasion. In those early months, I could feel it in my body, literally. In the course of 1 year, I touched another human being 5 times. That's it. Healthy touch, it's one of our most primary needs as human beings. Touch can release oxytocin, which is a powerful neurotransmitter that's related to feelings of social bonding and connection. I remember reading this op-ed in the New York Times about skin hunger. It made me weep. I experienced that, a real loss of human touch.
You've heard one of Michelle's losses. Thanks to those of you who have also shared in the chat about your own losses. Any type of loss can put a person in frame of grief. Some experts say that there are over 40 life events that can evoke grief. We will share a handout after this session, which outlines the list, so that you have it as a reference for yourself or working with clients. Of course, in our view, the list is truly endless. The handout serves as a starting point. Grief is a natural, organic response to the loss of something or someone. Its purpose, to get you to a place where you can live with the loss in a healthy way and take you beyond your initial reaction to loss. While grief itself is universal, there is not a universal way to process grief. You may be familiar with the Elisabeth Kubler-Ross model, which is shown here. She offered the 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, and acceptance. David Kessler, foremost expert of loss and grief, added a 6th stage, meaning. These 6 stages provide us some guidance of the deep emotions that may be experienced. And there's other emotions that may be folded into these stages. For instance, anger stage can show up as frustration, irritation, anxiety. What makes us label any of those emotions as part of grief? It is emotion connected to your loss, and it is unfamiliar, deep reaction to that loss with which you have little experience. As this slide suggests, the 6 stages of the Kubler-Ross-Kessler model are often presented in a smooth progression on a curve. If you think about it, it's like an amusement park ride, the roller coaster. But it often really looks closer to this slide. It's more like bumper cars. Maybe you'll feel acceptance for a moment, and then you're back in anger. And that's how it works. You can bump from one emotion to another. There is no preordained sequence. It's messy.
Kubler-Ross and Kessler do a great job with their model of introducing grief emotions. At the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020, Harvard Business Review published an interview with David Kessler. It was titled, "That Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief." It became a sensation. was one of the most viewed articles in HBR history. People are hungry for this. But as people strive to improve with their practice of managing teams, try to enhance their impact in a changing world, they're not sure how to apply it or what to do with it. That's where our framework comes in. We take this topic into the context of leadership, and that's uncharted territory.
There are scores of leadership competency models out there with dozens of categories and proficiencies, like this one customized sample of a leadership competency wheel. Of course, deep emotions impact the entire wheel. And yet, even when speaking about the competency of emotional intelligence, grief does not come up. Fear, vulnerability, and grief are part of humanity, but it is not often something that we are taught, and it is certainly not discussed as a leadership competency. A large percentage of us have organized our entire life around not feeling these feelings. The result of this? It limits the capacity of leaders in a changing workforce and in a changing world. It limits our capacity as human beings. We cannot be limiting now because there is a powerful subtext of grief for everyone. Unless leaders can make space for this, they will not be as effective with anything else. Of course, leaders want to show up in the best way for their people and organizations. Leaders want to foster an environment where people can thrive. So they are scanning for the best practices all the time. As coaches, you are well situated to see limitations and possibilities for leaders because you have established a container of trust. As coaches, you are positioned to offer a new lens by explaining our new framework to them, providing a space for them to explore, and then expanding their capacity. And as coaches, you can have a ripple effect in the world of leaders. The one-to-one coaching conversation can have a one-to-many impact.
So let's delve into the framework itself as we set forth the 4 key intersections of leadership and grief. Up front, it's important to point out our framework squarely puts the user at the center of the inquiry. This framework is inward-facing, not outward-facing. If you can't lead yourself, you can't lead others when it comes to grief or anything else. So with that in mind, we're going to invite you to practice with yourself here. We're big believers that we've got to do our own work first before we can bring it forward for others. So take this opportunity today. You've identified a loss for yourself. With that loss in mind, imagine placing yourself at the center. Experience yourself in the center. We will talk about you in the center. Then you'll be better equipped to help your leaders in the center when you draw upon this framework with them. The first intersection is leading in grief. Grief has rocked you and thrown you off balance. It has you. You do not have it. It has taken a toll every which way on your nervous system. It's intense and deep. When you are leading in grief, some days it may feel like a major accomplishment just to remember to breathe. That's what we mean when we say you are leading in grief.
So for someone who finds themselves leading in grief, be nourishing. This is back to the basics. Take care of your body, sleep, eat, exercise. Find outlets for yourself to replenish. Make time to unwind. Connect with others. When I was in grief with my father's death, I found myself intentional about my diet and taking walks to give me energy to swim in the deep emotions in me and around me.
Which leads to the second intersection, leading among grief. It's in your ecosystem. Others may be grieving. It surrounds you, even if it may not be inside you, quite to the same degree. That's what we mean when we say you are leading among grief.
Here, like Michelle pointed out, this is about loss in the ecosystem. So for someone who finds themselves leading among grief, be curious and sensitive. This is not just about you. This involves paying attention to those around you with patience and deep listening and powerful questions.
The third intersection is leading with grief. Grief may not be ever present, but it can come and go. We notice when we get hijacked, like unexpected landmines that could get triggered. Grief is still very much part of your journey, but it's in the passenger seat, not the driver's seat. This is what we mean when we say you are leading with grief.
Here's Michelle explain, grief is more like a companion. So for someone who finds themselves leading with grief, be present with compassion. When the grief does sneak up on you, and it will, allow yourself to be with it and be gentle with yourself in those moments. It is here, when you are leading with grief, that you have room to explore your relationship to the loss and begin to heal your heart. You can delve into your beliefs when it comes to loss and begin to reshape them.
And the fourth and final intersection, leading through grief. This is where you begin to shift your orientation to the grief itself. You settle with the emotions. You begin to evolve and search for meaning. You can feel both loss and hope. You put down some of your previous identity and you start making space for something else. The past isn't connected to the future in quite the same way. You're metabolizing the moment differently. There's this distinction that emerges from who I've been versus who I could become. This is what we mean when we say you are leading through grief.
So for someone who finds themselves leading through grief, be courageous. Dip your toes in to some other places. You may take some risks. You may question old beliefs. This is where real personal transformation occurs. Small shifts can have big impacts. This is where forward thinking comes in. The dark cloud of emotion has lifted, and you can start to tap into new potential. Embrace what you've learned. Bring your whole self.
In all the instances that Chris and I have covered, leading in, leading among, leading with, and leading through, you are leading in some respect. We'd like to distinguish that from managing. If you're comfortable doing so, I invite you to close your eyes. And for a moment, I want you to imagine yourself in a swimming pool. You have this buoyant beach ball in your hands. What happens if you force that ball underneath the water and you hold it there? And then you let it go. The ball's going to spring to the surface and jump into the air. It may do so in the same place or a different place, but always with a stronger force. It's the pop-up effect. The same is true with emotions. If you push down your emotions, suppressing them underneath the surface in an attempt to manage them, they will still live inside you and they will eventually emerge with a stronger force. You won't necessarily control where it pops or how it does. If your eyes are still closed, you're welcome to open them up as you consider this funky paradox. When we push away from the pain of grief, it will have the opposite effect, the pop-up effect. It's better to let yourself feel what you feel and find a different relationship to those feelings. Dealing with any loss, it's not about learning how to bury that pain inside, but rather how to effectively give voice to those feelings and move beyond the pain itself. Leading in, leading among, leading with, leading through grief.
You named a loss earlier, keeping yourself at the center of inquiry. We now invite you to consider how you are observing yourself and your relationship to grief. In the chat box, please let us know, what intersection would you put yourself in right now? Leading in grief, leading among grief, leading with grief, leading through grief, or as a fifth choice, you're in none of those intersections, but instead managing grief. We'll give you a few seconds to respond, and as you're typing, here are a few additional thoughts to consider. 1, you may be in one or more than one intersection at the same time, like I am in grief and among grief simultaneously right now. 2, you may move from one intersection to another in no order. And 3, you can also return to an intersection for the same loss or a new loss. For those of you who have responded, thank you. And now Michelle and I are going to move out of SlideShare and do a brief coaching demo to show you how this might operate between you and a client. To be clear, Michelle and I have not rehearsed how this is going to go. And we wanted to be a natural flow for us and for you. This will just give you a taste of how you might enter into a conversation. We only have about 8 minutes. So let's dive in. Hello, Michelle.
Hi, Chris.
So at the beginning of this presentation, we both shared loss, and others chatted in the box about a loss. Can you give me some context about your loss that you're experiencing?
So I appreciate that. You know, as I think about my experience over the last 18 months, there have been very distinct chapters for me in the pandemic. So the loss that I referenced earlier is probably not the most prominent one for me that's coming up right now. What is much more top of mind is related to my parents. My dad went unexpectedly into the hospital on January 5th of this year and didn't come home until May 17th. And even since then has had to go back to the hospital a few times. So it has been quite a life and health journey, helping and supporting his needs as well as my mom's needs. They're both kind of simultaneous and unique at the same time. And so when I think about it, I realize I'm frustrated because there's a loss of a year. I feel like I lost a really important year with my parents, which I know is true for so many of us. But that really sits with me of all of that time. So there's a loss of time. And I also am feeling, the generational tables have shifted. And I am now in a caregiver role. And so it means I'm doing a lot of different things with my parents. And it feels a bit like I've lost my relationship with my parents. Even before I haven't really lost my parents yet. And I will say the third thing that's coming up, and then I'll stop because there's so much loss, is that as I continue to sit with this, I feel like I've lost aspects of me. The caregiving role has been so consuming. So I feel like there's this, I'm mourning a loss of my relationship with my parents while I'm also mourning some of the relationship with myself. So there, I'll sit with those three as a cluster of loss.
Mm-hmm. And when you went through that, your losses, Michelle, and you're very familiar with the intersections. What intersection or intersections do you find yourself navigating right now?
It's definitely plural for me. I was intensely in it for several months. I think that now I am more with it, and I am always among it. That is just an ever-present reality for me. So with and among is where I find myself today.
And if you had to pick an intersection to explore, which one would you like to explore deeper?
I paused with that question. I appreciate it, and I know we have limited time here, so I would love to go deeper with this you at another time. What's hard for me as I sit with that is that for me, my loss feels so entangled with the loss that I know that my parents are experiencing. So my with and among just feel so tightly knitted to each other. It's hard for me to separate those because I recognize that if my mom has a bad day, I have a bad day. So I'm among it and I'm with it at the same time. If she has a good day, I have a good day. And so it's very hard for me to find a way to untangle them. But I will say in the last few hours since before we started this session, I probably had a bit of an unexpected landmine. So I'm going to go with.
Okay. And so it's with you, it's a companion, and you said you had a landmine. Do you want to give me a bit of context on that?
I don't know that the details of what happened are as important. And I feel like that could in of itself kind of take us down a rabbit hole.
Okay.
But it is an example where there's some difficulty for my mom right now. And so it is resurfacing for me. They're sort of cresting waves again of some emotions that had been settling and are now very much kind of lapping over me again.
And how is this impacting you as a leader, Michelle?
There are a few ways. One, I'm recognizing, like it's just so ever it's just in me and around me all the time that it's impacting how I'm showing up, like for myself, and it's impacting how I'm showing up for other people. So I'm just super aware of that. Yeah.
And how do you want to show up?
Well, so that's an interesting question. And I will say this has been an experiment for me because this has been very new terrain. And so I really I've been applying our framework to myself, I feel like all the time. And I feel like, in the past, I've been so accustomed to being in environments where leadership has meant, and I have literally been told, this isn't a place for you to show your emotions. This is not a place, find a different place. That's not how the team needs to see. That's not. So I feel like there's ways that I've been conditioned, and it wasn't going to serve me here. There was no, it's not a light switch. It can just turn on and off. And so I really practiced in the beginning of the year, and it was an experience. As an example, I had started a new collaboration with a different coach. We had a consulting project that we were doing with an organization, and I brought it forth in conversation with her in planning and recognizing I need to clear my cache before I'm going to be able to show up to do work with you. And I need you to also understand, I can't predict what the future is going to hold. I don't know what's going to unfold. I'm taking this hour by hour, and that I hope that you can work with me on that. And I was extremely lucky. She was a slice of heaven, but couldn't have been a more perfect partner and colleague. But it required me to have the courage to bring forth, this is where I'm at, and these are some of my needs right now. And it meant that, we had an all-staff meeting with our client, and in discussion with her, decided I need to bring this forth with them, because I don't know what's going to happen over the next few months. I need to make sure that if I'm being pulled away to the hospital, or I'm being pulled away for a doctor, that I can be authentic about that. And so it's been a practice. But I guess as I listen to myself answering that question, it's that last part, right? How do I want to show up? I want to show up authentically. Mm-hmm. And I can't do that unless I'm really bringing my full self.
So we have limited time. And I just, I think we showed a way to navigate to get into these conversations. One question I have is, what did you learn by this conversation?
I will say, I'm not going to put it in a past tense. I'm learning. It's ongoing. Mm-hmm. The ing is very real for me. What's coming forward with that question is that it is an ongoing exploration. It is ongoing work. It is ongoing excavation, and the importance to give myself some grace through the process. This is really hard. This has been a hard time. And so, lurking under the surface of all of this is the need to kind of be kind and generous with my attentiveness, both to those around me, but also with myself.
All right, Michelle, I know you're presenting next as I bring it into SlideShare again. I invite you to take a couple of deep breaths as I transition us.
Thank you. I will do that. I'm going to take you up on that offer. Whew. So I appreciate the opportunity to explore some of my grief with you, Chris, and all of you in the ICF Converge community. It is definitely powerful to situate yourself in the center of the inquiry build some self-awareness. So we hope that you all found that coaching demonstration useful. We recognize it certainly wasn't the full arc of a coaching conversation. It was just the tip of the iceberg, and there was far more to explore there. But we've covered a lot of ground today, and we're grateful for your presence in this brave space. So as you reflect on the session, we'd ask you to enter in the chat, or again, just write down for yourself, what is one insight that you are most excited to bring forward and put to use immediately in your own coaching, leadership, and life. As you're reflecting on your key takeaway, we'd like to point out a few extra bonus items for you. After this session, we invite you to visit the Pathable platform that's set up by ICF Converge, and you'll be able to get these goodies. They're going to be accessible for you to retrieve at your convenience between today, October 28th, and December 31st. First, Chris mentioned earlier, we'll be providing a handout to session participants that outline the 40+ life events that could evoke loss or grief. But remember, the list is truly endless. You'll also find a one-pager with the 4 key intersections as a quick visual reminder. And as an additional takeaway, we're going to provide soft copy links to our Leadership in Grief article for your future reference. Finally, there's a SurveyMonkey link. We welcome your input on this webinar in order to help us improve our offerings for other coaches and leaders. We ask that you complete the survey within 24 to 48 hours, if possible, from watching this session while it's all fresh on your mind.
We hope that this was relevant and resonant, offering a new lens and a sense-making tool regarding leadership and grief. The webinar obviously provided a brief introductory snapshot. If this has struck a chord and you're curious to delve deeper, either for yourself or with others, feel free to be in touch. We have more extensive modules devoted to each of the individual intersections and can facilitate for groups, organizations, and companies. Our contact information is on this slide and in your PDFs. You can find us in Pathable, and you can find us on LinkedIn too. Feel free to reach out to either of us individually or jointly. We are happy to be of service.